Welcome back all. Hope you had a good break. Our next session is Fireside Chat with Manny Maceda, Worldwide Managing Partner, CEO and Chairman of the Board, Bain & Company. To introduce him, please welcome Anand Panchalingam, Head of Digital and Technology, Khazanah. Anand, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, welcome to KMF2021, the invention of tomorrow. Now let me take you back 30 years to 1990 and imagine COVID-19 is set upon us. How radically different would our economic and social survival look in the face of the challenges faced by the pandemic? From the impossibility of online transactions to a higher risk of transmissions, global economy grinding to a halt. Today is heavily dependent on digitalization. As human beings, we long for connections, and interconnectivity is our savior. Now, coming back to the present day and for the future for all of us, where is transformation headed? For households, for businesses, and for government. Joining me in conversation today is Manny Maceda. He is the Worldwide Managing Partner for Bain, the CEO and the Chairman of Board for the company. Manny is an expert in business, digital transformation, and ESG leadership. His views are heavily sought after by World Economic Forums and international business. Manny is a Filipino, but now lives in America, in San Francisco, with his wife and 4 children. Manny, welcome to KMF.
Thank you, Anand. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So Manny, maybe I can start by asking you the first question. From the very start, from the very top, what does digital transformation mean to you?
Yes, and I said I'm privileged to be here. By the way, I wish I was with you in person. Digital transformation starts by doing meetings like this under this Zoom platform, and I'm privileged to be a chief executive of Bain. I do remember actually getting the message that I would become the next CEO while I was in Kuala Lumpur at the Grand Hyatt, not too far from the convention center. And so it's my privilege to be here. I would say I'll use a few slides, Anand, to introduce the topic a little bit, because I know digital transformation is a little bit of a buzzword. And so I think for the purpose of our dialogue, let me talk about it in 3 different ways. We'll put up a slide here. One is digital transformation itself, which we've been on this journey, as you said, for many years. Second, I think that it would be useful, you've already raised it, what has been the impact of COVID? That depending on which part of the world you're on, whether it's over there or here in San Francisco, or I've been spending a lot of time recently in Europe, can be very, very different. And then we are at the dawn of this era of ESG. So let's dimensionalize each of these different aspects of digital. First, just to clarify what I would say digital transformation means is that over the last 5+ years, we all know there are a number of, let's call them secular trends, new technologies that have enabled digital transformation of companies. You see them on the left side of this chart. It's obvious in some of them. We've all pivoted to mobile devices. Every company is putting some kind of a big data component to it. We moved our hardware to SaaS, to the cloud, Internet of Things, etc. And so we've been in this period of really dramatic new technologies that ultimately shift our business models, So when I say digital transformation, it's not just adoption of new technologies, it's actually changing business models. We are learning how to work with ecosystems and not just having technology suppliers, actually platform providers. We're changing the way we work in companies in agile ways. We're starting what we call engine twos, meaning entirely new digital businesses that can be separate and maybe totally replacing an engine one. We're all doing this in a way that follows and with use of data, real customer centricity, ultra personalization, ultra convenience, and a lot of user-centered design. So I'd say it's a starting point. Let's acknowledge these trends have been happening for years. And then the next issue is how are these trends going to play out by different industries? And so it's not affecting every industry at the same time. I think you'll experience that this is a curve. It's a little bit a visualization that some industries are getting disrupted more than others or faster than others. And so if you look at the far right, if you're in media, if you're in banking, if you're in retail, seamless digital integration is critical. You've already changed how you buy things, how you bank, how you communicate. In the middle are the industries where they're important to understand to maintain competitive advantage. And then in the far left, we can argue about this, that some industries haven't been subject to the same level of change yet. So I'd say I'd like to also leave a message when we say digital transformation. It's not happening at the same pace, but every industry is moving to the right in some way. And just like remember when banking became online banking, instead of going to a branch to make a deposit with a checkbook, it's going to apply to each industry as well. So, that's a little bit on digital. Now, what are we learning as we have seen success patterns in companies going through digital on the next chart? We would say that COVID actually is amplifying some of the lessons that we are seeing. What are those? Number one, that there is no digital transformation without the underlying technology transformation of what you use as a company or as an individual, whether that's your ERP platform or your communications platform, like this one. We've also been learning that changing people is often harder than changing technologies because we all have to adapt. Although I'll make a comment shortly on what we've learned from COVID. We've learned, and this varies a little bit company to company, country to country, that sponsors are key to success. In some organizations, this will only work if the top role models and assigns real leadership. That requires some risk taking because some of these things will not work. And we've also learned that incremental scaling pays over making a dramatic change in the whole company at the same time. Now, what have we learned about COVID is that it's actually made some of these trends happen so much faster, Anand, and you saw this in the last year, in multiple ways. You can take a platform like we're on, a Zoom. The number of people that went from this was a little side app that a Chinese, an American engineer named Eric Yuan, used to work at Cisco, developed on the side. Eric just completed a $1 billion quarter, and we all know the number of users. So what we've learned systematically across companies, Anand, is that this period during COVID, it's actually accelerated digital transformation. It showed all of us how fast we can move, either as individuals, as we learn how to work in our homes, or as companies, as we learn how to dramatically do things faster than we used to. By some accounts, it didn't change anything, but it accelerated things by 18 months, 3 years, 5 years. And so as different industries and different countries come out of COVID, we'll have to think about what that really means in terms of adoption. And then as we move forward, let's also think about what's happening next after COVID. Because if I look at the time horizons, we're at the dawn of another era, and so we have to learn about how the patterns of digital transformation actually work. We've said these are probably patterns you might recognize. They're not necessarily either or. They're a little bit. It depends on for all of the companies that might be represented here. How do you actually make a digital transformation successful or not? Here's a few choices. Patterns, chess moves. For some companies, you start by laying down some of the basic foundations. Build a classic infrastructure. Convert your ERP systems to cloud-based. Build some basic advanced analytics or data capabilities. Do some experimentation. A second pattern on the left is to actually integrate the digital landscape already happening in your company. Because what you'll see in most companies is there'll be pockets that show up all over the place, and they're often not coordinated. And so you need to orchestrate it with perhaps some kind of chief digital officer, something I know you're personally familiar with. Another pattern is you do front back, meaning where do you start? Do you start by digitizing customer interactions like retailers or banks did? Or do you start by digitally transforming the back office or the supply chain? And we'll often see that if you do a customer-centric transformation, front to back could be a better pattern. And then perhaps last is, launch a digital attacker, create a new business. I mentioned Zoom, was a new business. It was meant to be a better mousetrap compared to other digital platforms. A Grab is an example of a new business, as is an Uber, versus redesigning your own business models. So here's a few different patterns. And so as we're emerging from COVID, what are the lessons from COVID? How will each of your companies go after succeeding in digital transformation? I'll probably make one last point, and then let's have more of a fireside chat, a dialogue as we advertised. We are in the early stage of an even greater transformation going on in the world, and this is the transformation around sustainability, the environment, to be ESG. So one question that every global client we engage with, a lot of governments, even a lot of cross horizontal organizations like the World Economic Forum are asking, okay, all of us have been going through digital transformation in some way. We are learning how to do that in a COVID during and post-pandemic environment. Now, as we all embrace ESG, as we are one of 113 companies that have signed up that are members of the World Economic Forum to be net zero carbon by 2050 or 2040 or 2030. You're familiar that many countries, your own included, have set that as an aspirational goal. And so most of us don't know exactly how we will get there, right? So the overlap of digital technologies to help achieve the sustainability goals we have, are probably simply put here. It's tools to measure. We have to measure carbon offsets. It's tools to allow us to collaborate, because the circular economy required makes it imperative that different companies sometimes work together better. It's tools to innovate. It's tools to optimize. It's tools to allow us to understand risks, and frankly, perhaps augment the workforce, which creates pros and cons to digital, by the way, which you and I should talk about too, because it's often an enabler to some of the E part of ESG, but it's potentially an amplifier in some of the problems on the S part of ESG. At least that's the sentiment of many of the companies we talk to. So as we think about that, let's talk about what are the specific digital applications, perhaps, that help specifically on sustainability. Here's about 10 that we've identified. It's a rapidly expanding list. A few of them are more operational issues. Obviously, digital allows you to get more energy efficient, to measure carbon. A few of them are more about data. Traceability is one of the most important things that we've been doing some work on, because unless you can trace the carbon footprint of a product from the time it's thought of to the time it's actually bought, by you or by another company, it's very hard to say, are we making a difference in sustainability? And then a few are actually about the workforce, like what is hybrid working models? Well, once we're in the post-pandemic period, it's some of us may always work remotely. A lot of us, you mentioned, we're humans, want to get back together working physically. Many will work in some hybrid kind of way. So I'd probably wrap here by just, saying that businesses must take all three of these flavors into account. What is your digital transformation strategy? How are you going to do it as we come out of COVID? And how are you thinking about this as we embrace a multi-year ESG agenda? And, with that, we'll probably go off slide and maybe move to a more fun part of this conversation, Anand, and talk a little bit through whatever's on your mind. But hopefully,
thank you, Manny. That's really insightful and really wonderful to hear your perspective of how things are. How do you see it? Or perhaps maybe if I could ask you, where do you see the next 5 years, just the next 5 years in terms of the digital trends that's going to have an impact, especially for companies out here in Asia?
I would say I'd start with that list I showed earlier of the trends of the last 5 years. A number of those will continue. They're not done. Some of them have already all happened. We all know phones have gone to from fixed to mobile. Some of them we think are still in the early stages. Big data, advanced analytics, machine learning, business automation, cloud computing. And then the interesting question is, are there going to be new emerging technology trends that will have the same kind of impact as some of those things over the next 5 years? A widespread 5G deployment is probably an obvious one, that the ability of technologies to be enabled by just really high-speed Wi-Fi and cellular, we think would be good. DLT, distributed ledger technologies, i.e. blockchain, as not just as an interesting side speculative currency, but as an actual enabler to international business. Rollout of efficient and autonomous vehicles, we think will be interesting, and so that's not such as the electric vehicles, but potentially autonomous ones, and probably even higher improved machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so I look at where the venture capitalists in my neighborhood making the bets. AI is probably the biggest one, and you can see some of the technology implications in a post-pandemic world. Natural language processing, speech recognition, search, computer vision. So I think all of these will have implications, but I'm not as smart as some. Otherwise, I'd be a venture capitalist as opposed to a consultant on that. But those are probably a few that I'd speculate.
Okay, and it can be quite complex. So if businesses are planning to embark on digital transformation, or even those who had a strategy pre-pandemic, how will they approach this going forward?
I would say that everybody has tried some version of it and used this phrase, digital transformation. Well, not everybody. Most organizations have already been trying this. It's not easy. We've done lots of data on how lots of surveys and tracking, even of our own client base, on how many executives say they've been successful. It's amazingly small. Less than 5% of executives have said they've successfully achieved all of their digital goals over the last few years. About 20% have said we're pretty successful, but and the vast majority, 75%, says, we actually were more unsuccessful than successful. So let me just acknowledge by saying it's hard because of some of those patterns I mentioned earlier. It's hard for people to change, which is why the COVID period has been interesting because it actually forced some changes faster. We didn't have a choice. We had to. How many executives do you know didn't know how to use video conferencing, and suddenly now you can't survive without it. So I'd say in terms of how you approach this, we've learned that speed matters, and so a lesson from COVID to continue is to be able to be willing to move faster. But we also know now that the ability to scale matters a lot too. It's not just putting a pilot in one part of your organization. It's moving across the whole organization. And so once the scaling is what creates both what I call hardware legacy issues, such as most companies have a legacy tech stack that needs to be changed. Most companies have an operating model and how the company makes decisions that needs to be changed. And competing in the digital world requires transforming both the hardware, the technology stack. As I said, you have to change your AP systems, your CRM system, your business planning system, generally better to a cloud-based model. But you also have to change the software, and that's even harder than the hardware. And it's actual software and then the software of the company without disrupting the business. We did some work actually 2019 is when we started this with the World Economic Forum on what are the 4 key elements so that if I say, here's the minimum required to have a good shot to be one of those 5% or 20%. Number 1, have an actual strategy for digital. Right? Think about where your company is headed and how digital will actually enable it. Number 2, have an actual understanding of the business model to deliver that strategy. And when we say business model, it starts, what is the customer need you're trying to fill and how are you going to fill it? Number 3, have the right enablers to make that business model work, which is typically your IT, your enterprise technology organizations, your capabilities, your culture, your operating model. And then number 4, have a way to orchestrate it. A digital transformation of the company is a complex, multi-stakeholder, multi-initiative, almost a Rubik's Cube kind of sequencing of many things. And so having that orchestrator, which could be a chief transformation officer function, a chief digital officer function, to understand how all the pieces need to move. That's probably what I'd suggest are our key success factors, but I wouldn't pretend to say it's going to be easy. And in your batting average, may not be that high as most people have experienced.
Manny, let's switch a bit to what you spoke about earlier around ESG, sustainability and ESG revolution. Can you give us an indication of companies that have using digital very successfully to solve their sustainability issues?
I'd say, first of all, I will say that the number of companies around the world that have embraced a real sustainability agenda has just been going like that. 2 years ago, Anand, arguably, this was it felt a little bit like a fad, or it wasn't necessarily serious, like it's lip service. Well, of course we should be sustainable. Of course it'll be good. The level of commitment, the level of understanding, it's amazing how I'll talk to global CEOs now and how articulate they are about the specific, sustainability agenda. What are the initiatives to help address whatever their goal is, 2030 net zero. So I think there's a lot of good companies. One in Southeast Asia we're quite familiar with. I'll share is Olam. They're doing a digital first transformation and leverage technology to really disrupt and transform agribusiness, right? Both B2B and B2C. They have mobile apps to communicate with small farm holders. They have an information system on handheld devices. So there's both hardware technology and software application technology. They have an app source, a digital dashboard to help some of their companies. You see this. I like using that when you say digital transformation. It's not just the startups, the engine 2 businesses. Companies like Grab that totally revolutionize, which are inherently more efficient, right? Because you're taking an asset like a vehicle and getting it used more efficiently, which at least has an indirect impact on things like the carbon footprint, not just of the car, but the implication of pollution in the air. But companies like an Olam that are a well-established analog company also making those changes. And so we would like to think that just like companies embrace digital as enablers to what we call their engine 1, their core business, Olam did, and you could also launch an engine 2, a new attacking business, that same approach can happen in sustainability on all aspects of it, the E, the S, and the G. But one of the issues that do come up is digital's impact on sustainability is not always positive, and that's probably an issue too.
Yeah, and on that point as well, I'm assuming there's a lot of challenges with digital for companies to go through their sustainability issues. Any thoughts on that? What are key challenges they face with digital?
We've been doing some work on this same topic, actually, also with the World Economic Forum, and we've been surveying people. When companies take on an ESG agenda, and let's recognize E, S, and G, environment, social, and governance are very different topics. And when you look at how companies see the impact of digital, they generally view it as a positive thing on the environmental issues, because you can, the data, the capabilities to solve carbon neutral programs are it's clear it's generally a benefit, it's an enabler. Where it's raised as a concern, in fact, the hypothesis is obviously on some of the social issues, inequality, health, well-being, digital privacy, reskilling, and we see that here, and so there is this tension in that. By definition, the word digital and its impact on humanity and human beings. To some degree, it's creating productivity for us, it's tools. To some degree, it's supplementing what we do. To some degree, it's replacing us too. And then everything we do in digital and on how we interact with each other, this hybrid world, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So there is a real concern that digital transformation, it's impact on people. Job losses, automation, segregation, that misinformation via digital channels in social media. You could see them. In general, it's viewed as a positive to the environmental, the E part of ESG. Although even that, you could see will have some possible concerns. Electronic waste, or obviously there's increased energy use from video conferencing. On the other hand, if you look at the impact video conference creates, we can debate this. I'll give you a very specific example. We're a professional services firm, a global one. We committed to be net zero carbon by 2030, like many companies did. Well, you can probably guess what is the single largest contributor to our carbon footprint. It's air travel. And what happened in 2020 and even 2021, air travel declined by over 80%, actually. So suddenly you could say that looks really good. Now the question is, and we all learned you can conduct conferences like this one via remote. Now, obviously, on the other side of this pandemic, we expect we will, to some degree, get together again, get on planes again, get into cars again. That's going to have a very direct impact on our carbon footprint. And so yet by doing that, we'll also improve the well-being and the joy and the sustainability of our workforce, who in many cases actually want to have meetings like the Megatrends meeting happen in person. Those are the little micro trade-offs we will all be making as companies, trading off E versus S versus G, digital or not.
Thank you, Manny. I have a lot more questions to ask you, but I'm now going to open it up to the floor. Do we have any questions for Manny? Good question. What do you tell the board management when you embark on a transformation journey?
I do think when they raise this, it's either they're still thinking about it, or they'll already be committed. So, what I tell them is a little bit some of the things I've told you today. First of all, are you serious about it? And if you are, do you understand? How does it actually link to your strategy? B, what are the business models of your company? What are you thinking about changing? And then ultimately, how serious are you about doing this as signified by the choices and role models you make yourself? So Mr. Sulaiman, I'd say, if boards are serious, and management teams are serious, the level of seriousness is often demonstrated by who they put in charge of this agenda and whether they live and back up what they're saying, themselves. It's very hard for a board to say we're going to embrace digital or let's say video conference technology as a very narrow example of digital if you're not having your board meetings yourself. I saw this, I've worked with a lot of boards in all over Asia and here, and they say, we're going to digitally enable our board meeting. I'll make this point. And yet, before each board meeting, the board director gets a big paper book of every presentation, in multiple copies. So you get the point that being serious about it, understanding, and then role modeling it from the top. And we'd say that's often. I'd say that's a starting point.
Yeah, it resonates very well with what you said earlier about changing people sometimes is more challenging than changing technology. Any other questions for Manny? In your wealth of experience, do all digital transformation projects without committed sponsors sizzle out? How can we implement grassroots digital movements in big corporates?
I think this is actually a good question that I don't mean to imply that that everything has to be top down, and in fact, that's not the point. When we say committed sponsorship, means that the top in most companies actually are going to give this some push. Frankly, the grassroots model, which has some overlap with what we call agile thinking, is often how digital movements really start. It's frontline led because it's when you see what's happening at your customers, we call them clients in our case, and then the frontline people who interact with your customers are often where the grassroots movements start. When we say sizzle out, it's because the ideas never get horizontally transferred. The individual grass fires don't get coordinated. And especially for large corporates, connecting the dots so that an idea in one place gets rapidly adopted makes it the next level. Think about what happens after the grassroots. If you're a bank, and we saw banks do amazing things during the pandemic, and one country, one state, one province, one branch figured out a much more efficient hybrid model on how to interact with your customers. You don't want each branch to come up with their own game plan. If you find the best, roll it out fast, and that's where things can sizzle out. So we think a balance of grassroots ideas, but a way to horizontally adopt them quickly is probably a real success pattern.
Thank you, Manny. Any other questions for Manny? Workers aren't digitally sophisticated, might be displaced as companies opt for workers more productive in digital environments. Creating a wider digital divide, what are your comments and how can you use tech to solve this?
I do think this is such an important question for societies, and the responsibility for solving this is now, I personally believe, part of the responsibility of the companies. Obviously, it's partly a responsibility of the governments. But yes, this is a real issue. And so the heart of it has to be in training, upskilling, reskilling, and tech is actually part of that, right? So if you use, and oddly enough, by the way, what's happened as in countries that are on the other side of the pandemic are experiencing a massive labor shortage. I'm in this country, in the United States, where I'm in, where companies have learned how to work remotely and consumers are willing to buy remotely. The number of unfilled jobs is literally in the millions right now. And it's not just things like we don't have enough truck drivers in the UK, so nobody can get gasoline in London. It's all over. So oddly enough, there is actually demand for workers, and in a world where you have to create some kind of net for those who are going to be less productive. It's got to be retraining, reskilling, and readoption, and that requires companies and governments and often even academic institutions to work together. I'm more optimistic about this because what happened in COVID for the last 2 years is I saw companies care about this question more than I'd ever experienced before. And the definition of a company is not just optimizing for the benefits of your shareholders, but optimizing for the benefits of all your stakeholders, your communities, your workforce. So I'm optimistic, Anand, but this will be a hard issue.
Thank you, Manny. Any more questions? Digital is often viewed as a panacea when structural distinctives exist. What might be the role of large consultancies to shift these incentives, accelerate ESG and sustainability adoption among large climate pollutants that you have access to?
I'm not sure. Well, large consultancies, if that's organizations like us, I'd almost view us as, as you said, it's enablers. What really gets over what you call the structural disincentives for companies, who only have a right to exist because societies allow them to exist, is that, I'd say 3 things. If customers want ESG, and increasingly they do, we'd say 75% of customers will say we will change our buying behavior, or at least consider sustainable ESG in our buying behavior. If the workforce demands that you take it, and 80% of global workers tell us companies' ESG strategies are now part of their decision-making when they choose to join or stay with companies. And then the most important, arguably equally important to those, the investors, both public and private investors, including your own, are saying ESG now matters in how we allocate capital, how we measure our returns. And so those are what I'm calling creating structural incentives to overcome what might be the structural disincentive. The structural disincentive might be, I don't want to invest money that might have low ROI on a green project. Well, one tip I'll give is we are all now looking for high quality green projects to be able to deliver on our commitments to be net zero carbon by 2050 or 2040 or 2030. And so perhaps our role and the role of enabling organizations like consultancies are to help companies see that if customers want you to do this, and employees want you to do this, and investors want you to do this, it's probably a good thing to do. And hopefully there will be structural incentives to overcome the disincentives. So.
Great, thank you, Manny. We're running out of time, and I'm sure there's a lot more questions that everybody has for Manny Maceda. But Manny, I want to thank you for your insights, for sharing your knowledge, and giving us a bit more today in terms of the knowledge we know, but you have reinforced and made it better for us all. I want to thank you, and I hope to see you in person here in Kuala Lumpur when travel permits, hopefully in the near future. Manny Maceda, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Anand. My pleasure.